Hello there, welcome to our fourth talk, which is entitled The Turn from Self to God. And we're looking at Psalm 77 today. We've seen that we are on a journey from Psalm 1 to Psalm 150. A journey from simple trust in God to pure praise, which is the language of heaven. As we've also seen, it's a journey through questioning, doubt, despair, anger, self-pity, and protest. We've thought about psalms of lament and psalms of vengeance. We've seen too that all these psalms are psalms of faith. Faith addressed in the God of Israel, the God of Hesed, the God of steadfast love and kindness and faithfulness. Such expressions of questioning and doubt are very healthy, for it's only by facing and embracing all the seeming contradictions of our faith in God that we continue to grow spiritually, intellectually, psychologically, and so on. Now, last year I read this book, The Beauty and the Horror. It's by Richard Harris, who was Bishop of Oxford when I was in his diocese. It's a profound book, facing head-on all the seeming problems of faith in an almighty and all-loving God, all the horror we see and encounter, whilst contrasting this with all the multiple beautiful experiences we have in life. In particular, Richard Harris speaks about those many believers who have faced and experienced these contrasts and have come through to an even deeper faith. So, for example, we read about Simone Weil, Dostoevsky, and T.S. Eliot, for whom, and I quote, "Skepticism was not an alternative to faith, but an essential element of it." Now, Richard Harris then writes about the great Japanese writer Shusaku Endo, whose novel Silence was turned into an award-winning film not all that long ago. Endo's novel is about the terrible persecutions of Christians in Japan in the 17th century, but it was written against the backdrop of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is there that we find in this novel a Christian called Yogo, who says, and I quote, "I suppose that somewhere in the hearts of men there's a yearning for someone who will be with you throughout your life, someone who will never betray you, never leave you, even if that someone is just a sick, mangy dog." That someone became such a miserable dog for the sake of all mankind. Yes, the God of the Psalms became one of us. And people like Shusaku Endo have journeyed, to use Walter Brueggemann's classification of the Psalms, from orientation through disorientation to reorientation. And that's where we are in our talk today. Now, Psalm 77 is a classic example of that process. It's the turning of self to God. And it begins with a preoccupation with self. I'm going to read verses 1 to 6, Psalm 77. "I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. I remembered you, O God, and I groaned. I mused, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart mused, and my spirit inquired." In these verses, the word "I" comes 10 times, and the word "me" 7 times. There's a great deal of self-pity. There's also obstinacy. My soul refused to be comforted. This is a stamping of the feet, if you like. There's also a dwelling on, and even, it seems, a sense of enjoyment of the feeling of victimhood. Now, as you know, we live in a narcissistic society and culture. It's part, it seems to me, of that great heresy, individualism. Individualism says, what's right for me is right for me. Never mind my neighbor. There are politicians who play on this. A lot of advertising plays on it. And narcissism keeps us dependent. It panders to our egos. It traps us from being truly free. Now, going back to our psalm, it's been said that there's nothing wrong, if you like, in principle, with being concerned for the self, for grieving for the wounded us. It's the expression of one's feelings, getting it out. As a clergyman, I've had the huge privilege of trying to help people who've been bereaved. And very often, a person who's been bereaved might come to the point where they say, well, I should be moving on now. I'm so fortunate. I shouldn't be feeling these feelings. And I will often say, no, wait a minute. You're bereaved. It's a process. It's okay to feel tearful, sorry for yourself. That's the wounded you. Stay with that for the moment. But, of course, we have to move on. And so, going back again to this psalm, we find that the psalmist actually doesn't yet move on. Now, there's nothing wrong either in looking back on our lives when perhaps all was really going well for us. You probably noticed the psalmist does this in verses 3 to 5. I remembered you, O God, etc. In 1989, my wife Les and I came from South Africa to Newbury. And in South Africa, Les, my wife, had been nurtured in this wonderful church, Christ Church, Kenilworth. And I was privileged to be the minister there for a number of years. It was a wonderful church. Lots of people, lots of joy, music group, house groups, great worship, terrific. And we came in a sense of real calling to St. Nicholas, Newbury. Great privilege to have ministered there for 14 years. But initially, it was really quite hard going because it was really very traditional. And we would look back sometimes and remember our times in Cape Town. A bit of nostalgia perhaps, but we were looking back and saying, well, wasn't that great? But of course, we can't stay in the past. Yes, we embrace fully our disappointments, our pain, our feelings perhaps even of being abandoned by God. We don't deny it or suppress it. We go through it because there's no way round but through. But having expressed it appropriately, we have to move on. Now, a word about victimhood. Some of you may have heard of Edith Eger. Edith Eger was the author of a best-selling book called The Choice. She also wrote this superb little book called The Gift, subtitled 12 Lessons to Save Your Life. Now, Edith Eger was a victim herself in Auschwitz as a child. She's still going strong in her 90s. She's in the United States. She practices as a psychotherapist. Now, the first lesson in this book is about victimhood. And she says this: the whole reason to step out of victimhood is so that we can move into the rest of our lives. Many, many people are victims in some way. We ourselves might be victims of some wrong or something in the past. And yes, when you're a victim, you can feel very sorry for yourself, and you can blame God or life or fate and so on. You can even enjoy being a victim. I sometimes talk about the 3 levels of consciousness. Let me explain. A child is object conscious. A child might come into our sitting room and say, that's a chair, that's a table, and so on. The adolescent, the teenager, becomes self-conscious, quite right. Who am I? What is my identity? And in that process of being self-conscious, the teenager will sometimes blame others. It's not my fault, I can't help it, and so on. And well, that's a process. But the teenager has to move on into adulthood. We cannot stay as it were, an adolescent. Poor me, it wasn't my fault. We have to move on into maturity, into adulthood. So we move back to our psalm. The next stage comes in verses 7 to 9. I'll read these verses. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Here, the self-pity and preoccupation with self now seeks to draw God into the orbit of self-concern. And here there's a series of rhetorical questions. We have three of Israel's most precious covenant words. Hesed, loving kindness, loyalty. Hanan, graciousness and mercy. And Rehaim, compassion. This is all about the very character of God. The psalmist is saying, isn't God all these wonderful things? Almighty, all loving, and so on. Well, what about me? Now, when you and I are going through it, perhaps when we are sometimes worshipping God for all his wonderful characteristics, we might also feel, yes, but what about me? And we could be enjoying even our sense of victimhood. The turning point in this psalm comes in verse 10. I'll read it. Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High. Now apparently this verse is very difficult to translate into English. The New Revised Standard Version says, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. The New English Bible says, has his right hand, I ask, lost its grip? Does it hang powerless, the arm of the Most High? Walter Brueggemann says, the speaker has discovered that God has freedom, will not be on call, and will not be presumed upon. God is not locked into a quid pro quo. And then he goes on, observance of the freedom of God to change causes a terrible unsettling among the faithful. This hidden free God will be neither fully discerned nor completely predictable. So, and I quote again, here the psalmist is dismayed that God is not gracious when he, the psalmist, has fully counted on that predictable graciousness. And this comes very strongly, as you probably know, in the book of Job. Now, let's think about the freedom of God for a minute. It's a fascinating thought. And it resonates with what we know about God, the Creator's so-called freedom in the world of nature. The eminent scientist John Polkinghorne writes this, and I'm quoting now from a book which I found very helpful indeed, called The Language of Science and Faith. It's by two American professors, Carl Gibbison and Francis Collins. The latter, he headed up the Genome Project, as you probably know. And so I want to quote from John Polkinghorne. He says this, there's no doubt that part of God's interaction with the world must be that of letting agents or circumstances take their course. Without that, there will be no true freedom. And the gift of love in creation must be the gift of freedom, both to humankind and also to the universe itself, as it explores its own inherent potential through its evolving process. And so, commenting on the quantum theory, which is about quantum uncertainty, the authors in this book write, electrons, to a surprising degree, do their own thing. Any phenomena dependent on the behavior of electrons will have a tiny degree of unpredictability and will appear, in an odd way, to be free. I find that fascinating. So the psalmist faces a challenge to embrace a new and deeper faith. Either reject any belief in God or go deeper and relate to this God of freedom. Now this requires a new freedom on behalf of the believer. This is all about growth, as we've seen. I believe we see this in the case of Jesus and the healing of the Syrophoenician's daughter, which we read about in Matthew chapter 15 and verses 21 to 28. I'm just going to read that well-known passage now. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered her, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she said, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. I believe that Jesus moves here from saying, look, I was only called to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I've only got enough energy for that. That's my calling. I haven't time really to help other people, other Gentiles. But the woman persists. It's as though Jesus is tuning into his Father, and he realizes, oh, well, wait a minute. Actually, I've got to move. I've got to grow. I've got to be open. God is free, and Jesus is free to heal this woman's daughter. A great story. So the psalmist moves on to letting go of the preoccupation with the self and instead focusing on God. So verse 11. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds. He's looking back and thinking about God's activity in the past. Now, it's as though there's been a long pause between verse 10 and these two verses. Brueggemann writes, "This is like standing on the edge of a swimming pool, testing it with a toe in the water, putting off the dive and the quantum leap into the new world of imaginative faith." So the first part of the psalm is about playing safe, the second about letting go. And this begins, as we've seen already, with looking back and remembering. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I'll remember your miracles of long ago. I'll meditate on all your works. I'll consider your mighty deeds. Looking back in this sense can be a powerful stimulus to us in learning to let go and let God. Now, I personally have gained both great comfort and great stimulus to leave behind a safe belief, a narrow belief in God, and to move on into a more courageous faith, trusting God in all situations. And I've learned this by looking back at God's presence and activity in my life, in the life of my wife and myself and my family, but also reading biographies of great Christians down the ages who have stretched my faith in this great God who is at work at all times. Now, amongst modern writers, I've been particularly helped by the writings of Pete Greig, and you may have read some of his books. And books like God on Mute and Dirty Glory have helped me enormously in the whole business of this God who has freedom. So we come to verses 13 to 20. Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the worlds. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led you through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. From now on, a very different vocabulary is at work. The psalmist speaks of you, your ways, your miracles, your power, your mighty arm, your thunder, your lightning, your path, your way, your footprints, your people. Bruggeman again. God's way is wholly other, not to be accommodated or conformed to either my needs or my expectations. It's as though the psalmist says, there's no God like ours, no God so near, no God so free, no God so surprising, no God so exasperating. The narrow religious agenda is shattered. It's shattered by remembering, by awareness of God's incomparability, by referring to Israel's concrete history, but most of all, by the utterance of you. I wonder if you know George Herbert's poem, The Pulley. I'm going to read it now. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way. Then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that, alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not in the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. We can have riches, wisdom, honor, pleasure, and all the rest, gifts from God, but we're restless till we find our rest in him. Such a great poem, The Pulley. So we're back, if you like, to Psalm 73, which we looked at earlier. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. This is reorientation. This is maturity. This is a faith which satisfies. This is a faith which can face and indeed keep on growing through all of life's many challenges. Let's just be quiet for a moment. The turning from self to God. Father, we thank you that you give us the freedom to express all our griefs, our sorrows, our pains, our disappointments, our doubts. And you hear us. You're the God of steadfast love. But you call us also to move on, to move from the preoccupation of ourselves to you. We thank you for this great psalm, the psalmist realizing that you are what matters. Help us, Lord, to move right on to that place of finding in you all we need. We ask it for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen. In our next session, we're going to be moving on to praise, our destiny and our calling.